I'm here today in this evening to give a little talk about C++ community surveys and just also to talk a bit about what to do with the data which we get from this. And let me just start with a quick introduction. I founded Meeting C++ in 2012, and since around 2014, I do it as my main job. And I work as an evangelist for C++ and for the community as a community manager. And you can find me on Twitter at @meetingcpp. And there's two new great online features which I've implemented for or working on right now. Is the above one, the online meetingcpp.com. It's an online user group which started in August and also has a meeting on the 30th of August where Kevin Henney will give a talk about lambdas. And this week on Thursday, there is a talk, not a talk, a whole conference I organized online for the first time. And so Meeting C++ Online is a new set of online events which I organize through Meeting C++. But today I am here to talk to you about surveys, and the survey for Meeting C++ you find under survey.meetingcpp.com. And I thought I start with a little statement, and as you know, I'm probably a lot more on conferences as most of us, but after a while I kind of saw and began to understand that we kind of lack the data to have some interesting slides in our talks about the connection to reality, like who uses what features are used at all, and over time that's data we lack. It's data which we don't have or which we didn't have for a long time, and now we just begin to record that data in some ways or another, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. And basically also the question, what do we really know about the C++ community out there? And one truth about that is that there's probably a lot of data known about our community, but it's kept secret because it's connected to businesses, tooling, user data, internal customer surveys, which some external companies were paid for. I talked once to Herb, like, you know, what their usage numbers are for our Visual Studio, and he said, well, it's unfortunately he could not very detailed talk about this publicly because this is like internal data from Microsoft, for example. Then, of course, temporary surveys. I used to do those. Lift your hand if you use Library X service at the end of Meeting C++. And that was fun, but also just one short time frame. And even when we recorded them, it wasn't very precise, and you couldn't really turn those into graphs or get anything out of there just as an impression and just entertainment for the crowd while we were waiting for keynotes. And then, of course, there are commercial surveys. There are actually commercial companies which do surveys on developers, which probably know a little bit about the usage of C++ across the world. But of course, you kind of have to buy those surveys, or they are done for sales purposes or other purposes. And I so far have not seen companies making this kind of data publicly available. And then another thing which came to my mind are the so-called white papers, which especially in the embedded and Qt area, you see some companies doing not surveys, but studies in the field of how to use Qt for automotive or something like that. And then they offer you this as a white paper, which is usually a PDF, which you can download if you give them your contacts. And that's basically what is kind of available as data on our community from one side, but it's kind of, you know, not really available to the average user. And then there, on the other hand, are those kind of all indexes. And I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, the Tioba index was out for September. And C++ is now the fastest growing language in the world, which is fantastic, but you can't only compare the Tioba index with the Tioba index itself. It does not make sense. There's no relevance to other points in this world. It's just one data point which you can compare to any other data point that came from that source. And on the other hand, it's questionable how they track that, and does it really say anything? And for me, I think that the most value of the Tioba index is that it exists, and you basically get to say this for a month, that you can kind of get the headlines for that, and people kind of see it or get reminded of it. But you shouldn't really take too much seriousness in this. And this brings me to use cases. What can we do if we have this data and turn it into graphs? I think for teaching C++ in the form of talks at conferences, it's important to just back up your arguments. For trainings, of course, it could also be used. And then for communication, maybe your own arguments, especially in communication with the folks which are in the decider parts of our companies and which influence our community, but are not C++ developers themselves. Because it's just if you go to your manager and maybe they don't code in C++ anymore, or maybe they never did, they just come from some other language, or they never did this in any ways because they are for managing purposes in their position. Maybe it really helps to bring your point home if you have something like a graph, which is also coming from an external organization, which is trustable, to say maybe we should move away from C++ or move to C++11 or move to a newer standard, and that could help you in your own arguments. And the other points, I remember once upon a time I saw a talk which was this really nice story about how they move their code base to C++, to modern C++, from what they've been before. And it was really a nice talk with lots of examples how they improved their code. And at the end of the talk, when the questions came, I asked the question well, you're showing this as a success, as a project, but do you have any numbers on this? Do you have any internal measurements on that you are now more productive, that you have less bugs or something? And they didn't have that, and they could probably provide it internally, but they didn't thought about providing for this talk. And in the end, the answer the speaker gave was that they felt pretty good about it. And to me, it was an emotional answer. And if you think about that's okay, and I understand that as a developer you're emotional about your code, but if you want to quantify the success of such a project, your manager probably will look at other numbers, and they'll be happy if the team is happy. And that was basically his answer, that all the team of it is happy. And of course I can see that it improves your work day when you can move to modern C++. But for the viewers of the talk, which are not in that team and are not seeing and feeling that happiness, it will probably be also interesting to know what kind of hard numbers they could present to their managers to persuade them to make that change. And that's the kind of data which I cannot provide, which maybe some other companies could provide internal data when they changed to some standards. Which brings me to just quick overview on the surveys which exist. There are annual surveys by the ISOCPP Foundation and JetBrains. ISOCPP started 2018. JetBrains goes back to 2017, I think, maybe 2016. And prior to that, we do not really have data. I couldn't find really any good source. And So we kind of lack any data on C++ 11 or 14 adoption. And it's kind of, going into the future, this will be better. But also during 2017, I kind of got the 16, 17, I had the idea of having a survey tool to just know a bit more about the community, and it took me then 3 years to realize it. And in between, I did some Twitter surveys, and Twitter surveys are quite limited in the way you can express yourself. You can ask a question, and then you have 4 options to answer, and it's always single choice. And so I added a hashtag, which is kind of unique, so that I could find the surveys again later if I wanted them to use for something else. But it kind of makes it hard to ask certain questions, and some questions you want to ask multiple choice, or you would like to have more than 4 features, and the surveys only run for a certain time, etc., etc. So it's a nice tool for Twitter, but it's not really useful. And then when you combine questions, you have to be lucky to actually show something with it. And these queries I ran last year for my talk at CppCon about founding and running user groups, to just get an impression of who comes to C++ conferences and user groups from my Twitter audience. And so during the Christmas break last year and this year, I wrote the survey tool. It's a bit different, but also kind of similar to the existing surveys. I launched it then in January 2020. It's a continuous survey, so it's not like an annual survey, like which launches once a year and says, hey, we need your data. No, it's continuous and kind of, tries to collect data all year. The questions are right now single and multiple choice, and I think maybe some other question types could make sense in the future when I have time to implement that. But on the other hand, I'm right now busy with implementing all kinds of features for the conferences and other things which are more business relevant, as that's more relevant in this year. Yeah, this is like how the question looks. When you see it on the website, you can also skip it now. It's a feature which wasn't directly available at the launch, and the graphs, you see a bunch of those graphs also later in the talk, are done with Chart.js. And a few words on the technical details. As with software developers, the tool is session-based, and either you're logged in or you're just voting. So either it's a user ID which is tagged in the voting session, or I count a negative counter up so that I can put it in the same integer field to determine between logged in sessions and sessions which are not logged in. 2 new features I could write since then, because now I have some data in it and I can get playing with it. I will come back to that later. And important, I do save the data as an aggregate, but I also save the data as a single vote so that I can aggregate later over a certain time frame the data and not only have everything aggregated into one big data block. More technical details, so the question is locked for 30 days, and then you would be able to re-answer it. If you skip it at 60 days, and re-answering questions does not aggregate it. And yeah, so the one thing I really learned when I started this tool was asking questions is really difficult and really hard to get right, and especially the answers. That is an art form. We'll get later to a bit of those things. You can kind of still see that in the tool. But first, let's have a case study on standard adoption, because I think that's, if you look in the studies of those surveys and the results, that's probably the most interesting thing which we can extract from it for now. Jetbrains has this usage of standards in regular use since 2007, and there's 17 in their survey, so we kind of can see the data going back for 3 years now. And there we see that C++11 is very popular, and that will stay very popular with Jetbrains users. And yeah, so as you also see, this is a multiple choice question, and JetBrains changes every year the way they display the results of their survey. So most beautiful service result by JetBrains, but it's kind of, when you want to compare from year to year, it's kind of hard to do. And so we see even in this year for JetBrains, C++11 is in the multiple choice question in the most popular language. ISOCPP asks the same question, not directly, but in a similar way. They ask kind of, what are you currently allowed to use in your project? And they give you 3 different options to answer per standard. Not allowed, partial, and yes, like most features would be available to you. And with this, we see that in 2018, also C++11 was the dominant language in this. It's a bit harder to compare because they kind of introduce the other options. And but at least they're consistent in the way they display this. So this is 2019, C++11 now is by a thin margin the most popular standard. And in 2020, it is the most used standard. But I think that's also the case because this is multiple choice. And if you use C++20 or C++17 or 14, you also use 11. So the only users which are not using 11 are using 98. And technically, you also could say that if you use C++20, you still use C++98 in some parts. I have a similar question, I think from the result here that is single choice. You clearly can see that then in June, C++17 wins, and that is in September still the case. In this case, in this time, I gave a similar talk in June, and I chose not to replace all our graphs in the talk. So that we sometimes can see the differences which have been between June and September. This is now multiple choice, and also we see that now C++11 is the dominant choice here, which wins the day, which is kind of clear. And if you go in the September version, it's still the same case, and it's not much has changed. C++20 has gotten a bit more in numbers, but that's also to be expected. But if I ask, what is the standard you currently use the most at work, and this is single choice, then C++17 wins, interestingly. But I also think that, and I think that's something generally true, that all of those surveys are biased. And if I go in the September version, the only difference actually is like C++11 gets in the September version and the second place. And now there's a bit more users use this at work the most than C++14, but it's still pretty similar. And this kind of, will be interesting to see how this evolves in the future. But I was talking about survey bias. I do think just naturally that all of those surveys are biased. And in 2 different ways. The first bias which is introduced is by the organization, which runs the survey and kind of selects the questions. ISOCPP asked a lot of questions about the standard. JetBrains, of course, seems to ask a lot of ecosystem questions. And this then also introduces, of course, a bias in the audience, because who has the audience in those surveys? How does the audience get selected for the survey? But for me, it's a lot of social media and who comes to conferences, who reads my newsletter, etc. So you basically have to know meeting C++. And that is also, I think, a heavy selector for folks which are interested in C++ and have enough interest to also maybe follow privately on Twitter, Facebook, or other sources, or watch YouTube videos where I sometimes put the link on. And so combining those surveys kind of gives you a good impression of overall things in the community. And on the other hand, I am able to ask a lot more questions in my survey, and we'll get to that later. Oh no, we get to this now. We get to ask some questions in the survey. So for CppCon, I put in the question in spring, because I have this for most major C++ conferences, which exist for long enough that there can be enough answer options. And I end at 5, so 5 or more. And you see that we reach not a lot of people with the conferences in attendance. This is the specific question here. Did you attend? Do you know about CppCon, which would probably be 100% because we self-selected for the audience which is interested in C++ already. But on the other hand, you see that there's a big block of folks, because I gave 2 options to answer if you haven't attended it, and there's like one big block which wants to go, and there's one big block which thinks it's not feasible for them to go. And that's for this pattern stays true for all conferences, even for meeting C++, which I find really interesting. So I have the hope there's a new online format. We are maybe able to reach a few more of them. But on the other hand, there seem to be a lot more C++ users out there which are not going or not able to come to conferences than we currently reach through having the conferences. And that's, I think, so a good point to understand why it's so important to have the videos online. And yeah, we already had this question, but I'm just going to jump over it. But once I had all those standard questions in the survey, I kind of figured out I'm actually able to answer this question. That's nice, but I also would be able to ask some questions which I found way more interesting, like which SDL containers do you use? And I think it's hardly surprising that vector wins, but yeah, I decided back then also to put span in it, and some folks already have educated me that span is not a vector or not a container. But I thought it's better to have people educate me about that and have data on it than have other people educate me on why span is missing. Because that span is not a container is probably not very far spread knowledge to a lot of folks. That's probably news. And on the other hand, span is a new concept, and you don't really know what people think a span should be or is in their mindset in the community. That's a whole different topic also, I think. And the rest is kind of not really a lot of surprising things. I found it interesting that there's a lot of users seems to use forward list, which is natural. If you have a lot of people using lists, there should be some use cases where forward list is giving you a performance boost. I have some questions about build systems and similar questions. This is a multiple choice question, because the single choice question is basically one big bar for CMake, and it's kind of sad to see that so much of the C++ community goes now into CMake, and of course can argue if CMake is a build system, but again, if I don't put it in there, people will ask why it's not in there. And on the other hand, one day I asked myself, what about standard features? And when I did the research on that, I found out that at least for the newer standards, that is a possibility because we don't release so often and we don't wait 10 years. So that is for most of the standards quite feasible to ask this question for the language and the library features, because if I combine those, it's a mashup which I don't want to have, and it's too many options to answer that the graph doesn't make sense anymore. So I have a graph on the library features, and for C++17, it's hardly surprising that ST optional wins, and then there's 3 other library features which are also used a lot, and this is like one of those graphs which probably will be very interesting to see how they evolve in the future. If some people, pick up parallel algorithms when they become available, more widespread, and that not a lot of folks use mass special functions is, I think, also clear. That's something which barely made it to the standard because implementation and just getting this right was difficult. And the same question for the language feature shows that the language features are far more used than the library features, which are not like really common features which you wanted to always have in your language toolbox. So it's also here, I think, hardly surprising that structured binding is in the lead, and then there's a few other, followers, which if we have this evolve in the future, maybe this changes. We have to see. And while I do ask this for 14 also, I haven't done it in here, and I chose to only show you the C++11 library features and not the language features. So here it's kind of also not hardly surprising that all the heap allocations now use smart pointers. That was a big feature of C++11, as you probably can see in here, and that the part of the community who uses type traits is, of course, now also on the standard type traits is also not so surprising. But I do also ask some questions which are more about the community and not about C++ in specific. So I ask what other languages people use, and this is the result. And when I ask the same question, ISOCPP asks the same question, and they kind of have similar results. C and Python is very popular, and then there's some Java, some JavaScript. And also, again, I think this question will just be interesting to see how it evolves over time. I talked about bias, and I think that is a graph which shows that my survey is a bit Europe-centric. Trying to change that, I did the lightning talk about this at CppCon, which brought a few more of folks doing the survey from North America. But yeah, I hope this over time will change. But right now, it shows also that my own reach into the C++ community is very Europe-centric, at least for folks finding it important enough to do the survey, I guess. I asked about age, and I think it's hardly surprising to see that in the IT industry and in our language, there's the big block in the 30s, and some younger folks coming with us, and then the older folks which have been in standard and standardization and have been working on C++ since the 90s often are still around. And I also asked kind of, in how many companies have you worked as a C++ developer? And this is one of the few times where you also again see a bit of a difference, since the above picture is from June, and the below picture is from September. And since that, you see that there has been now a small lead by the folks which do this in the second year. I have had 2 employers and not 1 employer, and it was the opposite in June. And I don't know how this is going to evolve. Over time, it becomes clear that people change employers, and so it should at one day really, have second and third employer folks becoming more dominant in this graph in the next years, in this decade, I think. I've added some new additions and questions, like Qt 5.15 came out, and I probably add Qt 16 to the Qt version question, package manager spec, and everything that's after other, because at the beginning when I started to design questions, I often, was happy that the question is done, and I put at the end an other option, so that everything that wasn't covered could be covered by this other option. But in reality, some people are really not happy that their library or something else is not covered in the survey, and it should, and some people were right about that. So in the later questions, I often have the other option and the non-option at the beginning to not have that in the middle at some point in the survey. But I am not able to reorder the survey options. The way I store the survey answers is in a specific way that allows me to add options, as many as I want to, but I'm not able to reorder them in any other way. And so that's why anything you see in a survey which comes after other was added later. And the last questions I added were about testing, and I also added a question about using DRM GUI, because the UI question had DRM GUI in it. And from that survey, I know that there's quite a lot of users for DRM GUI. It's, I think, 2nd or 3rd place in there after Qt. Qt is a big lead. And planned questions. Today, I just had an interesting idea for a question. There's sort, stable sort, and there's a third sort, and then there's I think a parallel sort option now also in the STL. There's at least 4 different ways to sort in C++ now. And it would be interesting to see how many folks are also using something else than std sort. And yeah, there's also an stdq sort, and which comes actually from C, but I couldn't probably would include that, because if I don't include it again, people will tell me that they're using it. And yeah, the C++ 20 library and length feature question will come up, but I want to wait a little bit until people have experience with the language. And I didn't put it in when I designed the original survey, because it was not a standard then, and I was thinking, it does not make sense to collect data on a standard which doesn't exist, and I wanted to wait at least till the point it's released, and then probably have it included just before this year's conferences in October. And also, some other plan that came up with the survey tool is that I could ask as one of those survey questions every day on Twitter and the other social medias, which I do since June. And this is more or less a round robin. Some questions I excluded, like the conference questions. It does not make sense to keep asking that. It was just only lead to accumulating more and more folks on those questions which haven't been there or want to go, and I'm more interested to have more folks which have been there. So I usually post only those on the social media when the conference is running, like I did last week for CppCon. And then some user statistics. This is a graph which usually isn't public, but I thought for this talk I'll just include it. This is a survey activity on how many questions have been answered in the last hour for the last 48 hours, and this graph is generated in a way that it skips over any hour which didn't have any activity, so it expands and contracts by the activity there is. And you see in the last hours there's a bit of activity, since I have lots of ways to find the link to the survey right now, and folks also coming forward with the announcement of this talk here. I redid my lightning talk on the weekend to just have this on my own Twitter channel, because I really have no idea when this is released at CppCon's channel. And then I have this graph in a different way to have the sessions per hour, which actually have been active in the survey. And here you clearly can see that I today posted a poll on social media at 4. And if I go back, you can see at 4 there's not a lot of activity in the survey, but it's from a lot of different folks answering the same question. The one question got a lot more traffic than it usually probably would get in an hour. And that's basically also kind of the concept I do with asking a question every day. So you basically fill your survey session out over one question per day. Which brings me to the bonus slides. One feature I wrote for my talk in June was the ability to pick 2 questions and then filter the second question on the answers of the first. And I think there's a few questions which can be fairly well paired with other questions. But like one question where it would be really interesting is the question with the continents. Then you could see like who uses what standard on the continents and how do they differ. But in order to have that really interesting, I'm currently lacking the data on other continents. I'm really well having data on Europe, but I don't have data on other continents so much that I could follow up this with other questions. And this is an example I did in June to see if the number of devs you work with has an influence on whether or not you would recommend the workplace you are in. And I don't really see a big relation here. But on the other hand, the disadvantage is that you basically have this Cartesian product of questions, which you can combine, and there's just so many possibilities, and most of those combinations do not make any sense. Like combining the standard features with another standard feature doesn't make any sense. So it's a nice feature that is implemented, but it's really hard to use, and only a few combinations actually make sense. And on those combinations which I really would like to have maybe for talks, sometimes the data currently is not sufficient. One feature I implemented last week for CppCon, kind of because it was needed, is to be able to generate a graph from the raw data and just select a certain amount of time in that the survey should be active for. And in that way, next year, of course, I will have to add the years. This is just a short hack to make this work for this year. So you could then select from April to now and get the result of a quarter or something like that. This will probably be a very useful feature to get some graphs for 2020 in the next year, and also will help with just seeing some time differences in graphs over time. in the future. So I think this is like the big takeaway from my tool, that I have this data stored in the database, and we keep collecting data, and then we're able to basically reuse this data every time we have a question on it, or we see like new possibilities for it, and just see how things evolve in the community now, which we prior to that see like a yearly spot, or just also like, and even if we look at those surveys, we see that the surveys only go back to 2017. And this brings me to questions. And if you want to take the survey, you'll find the survey under surveymeetingcpp.com. You can very easily take the survey there. If you're not logged in, you need to solve a CAPTCHA once. And if you're logged in, the CAPTCHA will not be there. And if you're logged in also, you will be able to see all the results. And there's another feature which I wrote on Sunday. Finally, there is, for the result view, also the view of all questions, so that you don't have to iterate over all questions to find a question. And that was very helpful for updating this talk.